Hey 8th graders, I'm Ms. Henderson. I'm an 8th grade ELA teacher at Ferndale Middle School, but I'm really excited to be working with you today. For this lesson, you'll need your ELA notebook, a pen or pencil, and the book George versus George, or core text for this unit if you have it. Today, we are going to be writing an objective summary of a text. A summary is a short retelling of the most important information of a text, and it is objective, meaning it doesn't have any opinions or facts, and this should be a review from our previous unit. Summarizing an informational text is very different than summarizing a fictional text. In a fictional text, we're going to focus on the character and how they respond to the conflict. So we use that somebody wanted but so then strategy. In an informational text, we're focusing more on the topic of the article or the text and how the author expands or discusses that topic. So we're going to focus on our topic, we're going to look for the central idea of the topic, and then the key details that get us to that central idea. So this is what we're going to focus on while we're reading today. So why is it important for us to be able to summarize an informational text? Well, especially in a unit like this one where we're doing a lot of research, it can be really overwhelming, all the information that we get in a text. So writing a summary helps us decide what is the most important information worth remembering. So in order to write an objective summary, we want to pull out these key things. We're going to identify the topic. That's the person, place, object, or event that the article or the text is talking about. Then we're going to determine the central idea. So what does the author want us to understand about the topic? Then we're going to point out all the supporting or key details in the text that lead us to our central idea. So what information about this topic, what information in the text led us to the central idea? We're going to use this very simple organizer to help us list our topic, our central idea, and our supporting details, and we'll use this a little bit later to actually write out our summary. For this unit, we're going to be using this core text, George versus George. Your teacher may be using a different text to model the skills, and that's okay. For these lessons, this is the text I'm going to use, and if you don't have it available, that's fine, because I'm going to be putting what we need on the screen. There were once two enemies who were both named George. George Washington was the man who freed the American colonies from the British, and George III was the British king who lost them. Was King George a royal brute? American patriots said so, but others hailed him as the father of the people. Was George Washington a traitor? The king's supporters thought so, but many celebrated Washington as the father of his country. Who is right? There are two sides to every story. So in this unit, we're going to become experts on the American Revolution. So what do you know about the American Revolution? Do you have any knowledge of the reasons we broke away from Great Britain, or the Boston Tea Party, the Boston Massacre, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights? If you don't have any background knowledge on this information, that's totally fine, because by the end of this unit, you'll be an expert on the American Revolution. The American Revolution occurred in colonial North America between 1765 and 1783. The American patriots in the 13 colonies defeated the British in the American Revolutionary War, which was from 1775 to 1783. Gaining independence from the British Crown and establishing the United States of America. So the American Revolution allowed us to go from the 13 American colonies eventually to the 50 United States of America. So without the American Revolution, we wouldn't be where we are today. Now let's hop into the text and practice summarizing. While I'm reading, see if you can identify the topic, what this section of the text is about, what the author wants us to understand about it, and the details that led you there. The year was 1763, and in many ways, George Washington of America and King George III of Great Britain were very much alike. Both men had light blue eyes and reddish-brown hair. Athletic and dignified in appearance, each stood well over 6 feet tall. towering above most other men during a time when the average height was 5'7". Both were honest and popular with the public. They liked simple food and much preferred plain clothes to the high-fashion outfits of the period, decorated with lace, ruffles, and embroidery. George III was sometimes called Farmer George because of his lifelong interest in agriculture. George Washington was a farmer who was happiest when working on his land. Both were excellent horsemen and loved hunting. George III believed that a king should rule America. For a long time, George Washington thought so too. He had even fought bravely alongside the British Army. Now let's pull out the information we need to write our summary. So the topic of this section was George Washington and King George III. So what did the author want me to understand about George Washington and King George III? This whole section told me that they were similar in many ways, and I was able to figure that out with these pieces of evidence. First, it says both men had light blue eyes and reddish brown hair, so I'm going to put that in my graphic organizer. I also saw where it said that they each stood well over 6 feet tall, so they were similar in height. They also were honest and popular with the public, which tells me they were both loved by their people. Then in this section of a text, it says they liked simple food and much preferred plain clothes to the high-fashion outfits of the period decorated with lace, ruffles, and embroidery. So that helps me understand that they like similar foods, so they both like simple foods, and they like plain clothes instead of those really fancy clothes they wore at the time. So what I'm going to put in my graphic organizer is that they have similar tastes in food and fashion. This next part of the text tells me all about how they're interested in agriculture, or they're both farmers and they love farming, so I can put that they were both farmers. This last section, these last pieces of evidence that I pulled, talks about how they both believed in a king ruling the colonies. And so that was my last piece of evidence. Both believed in the rule of a king over America, at least initially. So now that I've pulled all my information, let's organize it into a summary. So all I'm going to do is use the sentence starters from this rubric, and I'm going to insert the information that I already found. So we already did most of the work at the beginning. So we're going to start with our introduction. We're going to put where we found this information, the section, the page number, the title of the book, and the author. So the section, At First Glance, that was the section in this book, in George versus George by Rosalind Schanzer. That's our author. Now we're going to identify the central idea. So I've given us a sentence starter. It's mostly about, describes, discusses, explains. So this section explains that George Washington and King George III were similar in many ways. So now I'm going to insert the details that I used to come to this central idea. And what we don't want to do is just put in the bullet points. We actually have to write it out in paragraph form. And so my details came to look something like this. King George III and George Washington had similar features like height, hair, and eye color. Pulled those right from here. They also were loved by their people and had similar tastes in food and fashion. Both men were also farmers and initially believed that a king should rule over America. So again, all I did was combine these bullets into those sentences over there. And we're going to end with our citation. And this is really important, especially in a research lab, because we want to be able to go back and look where we found this information. And we also want people to know that we didn't make this up. We pulled it from the text, and it tells people where they can go to look for that. So our citation is going to include our title, our author, and our page number. And it's going to look like this. George versus George, Rosalind Schanzer, 8 and 9. And our written summary is going to look something like this. The section, At First Glance, in the text George versus George by Rosalind Schanzer explains that George Washington and King George III were similar in many ways. King George III and George Washington had similar physical features like height, hair, and eye color. They also were both loved by their people and had similar taste in food and fashion. Both men were also farmers and initially believed that a king should rule over America. And then we're going to end with our citation. Now you're going to practice. You're going to follow the same steps I just walked you through to create an objective summary about a section of this text. You're going to summarize page 13 from this text, George versus George. While I'm reading, you're going to follow along, and you're going to be on the lookout for the topic, what the author wants you to understand about the topic, and then any details that lead you there. London, with its 740,000 inhabitants, was the biggest city in Europe and the center of British government. London's residents were proud of their long history and high level of cultural achievement. For fun, they went to masked balls and theater, gambled at cards, dice, and roulette, belonged to all sorts of clubs, and met at coffee houses, taverns, cockfights, chop houses, and pleasure gardens. Noisy streets teemed with horses, carriages, ballad singers, flower sellers, fishmongers, and ladies and gentlemen in fancy white wigs wearing all the latest fashion. But the overcrowded city had its share of problems too. The death rate was high. All the coal that residents used as fuel caused black rain and thick, sooty smog. Food and drinking water were often unhealthy, riots were common, and public hangings drew rowdy mobs. Thousands of beggars and pickpockets were evidence of poverty run amok. While I was reading, were you able to come up with the topic of this section? You should have come up with the topic of London. This whole section was about the city of London. Take a second, pause the video, come up with the central idea. What is the author trying to get you to understand about London? And what pieces of evidence or what details from the text does the author use to get you there? All right, let's check your answers. You should have said that this whole section was about London, which is the center of British government and many cultural achievements, but it also had several issues. In this first section of the text, the author talks about all the things that they do. They have people who went to masked balls and theaters, they met at various clubs, the streets were filled with carriages, artisans, and high fashion. So in the second section of this text, the author points out some of the negative things, like an overcrowded city, unhealthy food and drinking water, pickpockets, poverty. So that second section talks about the number of issues: high death rate, pollution, unhealthy food and drinking water, and high poverty. So now that we have the information we need, we're ready to write a summary. Take a second, pause the video, and use the information from our graphic organizer to organize your summary, and then go ahead and write out your summary with your citation at the end. All right, now let's check your answers. You should have started out with an introduction that looks something like this. Page 13 in George versus George by Rosalind Schanzer explains that London was the center of British government and many cultural achievements, but it also had several issues. Then, in the second section, you should have included all of this information, not in bullet points, but in paragraph form, to look something like this. People in London went to masked balls, theaters, and clubs. The streets of London were filled with carriages, artisans, and high fashion. London also had a high death rate, pollution, unhealthy food and drinking water, and a lot of poverty. And your citation should have looked something like this. Your summary may have a little bit different information, but if it has most of these things, then you're probably on the right track. Your written summary should look something like this. Page 13 of George versus George is about how London was the center of British government and many cultural achievements, but it also had several issues. People in London went to masked balls and theaters and clubs. The streets of London were filled with carriages, artisans, and high fashion. London also had a high death rate, pollution, unhealthy food and drinking water, and a lot of poverty. And end it with our citation, George versus George, Rosalind Schanzer, page 13. So as long as you have some of this information, I think you can be confident that you're on the right track. Now you're going to practice this on your own. While you're reading through various articles, doing your research, practice summarizing the text. This is going to help you narrow down the topics that you find interesting, and this skill will really come in handy when you start your actual research. So use the same graphic organizer and summarizing rubric to help you do this. So let's review what we did today. We reviewed the components of a summary. We started to become familiar with the topic of our new unit, the American Revolution. Then we dove into our core text, George versus George, where we practiced organizing an objective summary. We also learned that George Washington and King George shared many similarities despite leading opposing governments. Then we learned that London, the center of British government, had many opportunities and achievements, but also had many issues. Hopefully after this lesson, you're a little bit more comfortable with summarizing a text, and you're really going to be able to apply this in your research unit. Thank you for learning with me today. I can't wait to see you back here for our next lesson.